Hi, everybody. Welcome to our updated webinar today. It's on Athlete Alive 2025. We're celebrating Celebration of Champions. Today, we're going to be exploring how two of our Athlete Alive 2025 champion universities have implemented best practices for preventing student athlete injuries and deaths related to conditioning and training. Today's topics are going to include strategies for proper emergency management and other initiatives that have earned these institutions the prestigious Athlete Alive 2025 champion status. Part of this is going to be recorded, and so anybody who has registered for it, you'll certainly get the recording, and then also this will be posted on the US Reps YouTube channel as well to review it some other time as well. If you have any questions, please add those to the question and answer function on Zoom, and we'll answer those at the end. So continuing, my name is Francis Nerick. I'm the outgoing president of the U.S. Registry of Exercise Professionals, and my day job is Associate Vice President of Certification and Credentialing here at the American College of Sports Medicine. Joining me today are my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Brian Biagioli, Daryl Conway, and David Bass. Brian currently is the Graduate Program Director of Strength Conditioning in the Department of Kinesiology and Sports Science at the University of Miami, and serves as the Executive Director for the National Council on Strength and Fitness Board for Certification. He's very active in the fitness industry and presently serves on 4 national committees related to standard setting, education, accreditation, and population engagement in physical activity. And Brian is also the incoming president of US Reps. Daryl serves as the Executive Senior Associate Athletic Director, Chief and Health Wellness Officer at the University of Michigan Athletics. Daryl's professional interests lie in the fields of emergency planning, catastrophic and crisis response, athletics risk management, opioid overdose management, exertional heat injury management, and on-the-field management of cervical spine injuries. David is in his 21st year at Wake Forest and currently serves as Assistant Athletic Director for Sport Performance. David provides oversight to the sports performance and sports nutrition departments, developing and implementing the unit's objectives to meet the athletic department's vision of developing champions. And so welcome to our folks. Kind of starting us off, I think maybe I'm going to, as part of this panel discussion, we're going to kind of go around for you guys. But Brian, can you give us kind of a background? What is Athlete Alive, and why? How did it come to be? And how does that fit into the kind of the broader goals of the U.S. Registry of Exercise Professionals?
Sure. I'll give you the history that really fulfilled the mission in a little bit. But the Athlete Alive 2025 recognizes those institutions that are focused on best practices in student athlete safety and health, and inclusive of that heavily is within the performance domain. So that would be including those individuals that oversee all performance, inclusive of the strength and conditioning professionals that work in that department. And it actually all came about, this goes back all the way to 2017 in light of the numerous cases that were being publicized related to exertional death and rhabdomyolysis. The NCAA Sports Science Institute leadership called on the members of the United States Register to address the strength and conditioning coach qualifications, specifically at the collegiate level. We then looked to form a task force to really evaluate what were the causes of, the root causes of the problem, and possibly look for solutions. But so the first thing I did was look at how intense was this problem? Is it just because it's being popularized by a couple of cases, or is this something that's an ongoing situation? So I went and I looked into the NCAA reports just specific to football that they had posted on the internet under the Sports Science Institute, and I saw that since 2000 there were over 30 deaths that were associated with plausibly controllable situations, many of which were exertionally related overheat. There were some that were sickle cell related, but much looked like it could have been mitigated. So then the next thing I did was look at the different areas where these occurred and in what institutions, and I found that none of the supervisory authorities were appropriately certified or educated in that particular realm, which I found immediately that that's a situation. So the next thing I did was investigate further. I went to the NCC SIR, which does all of the reporting on athlete injuries. They're institutionally and self-reported. And I was astounded to find the number of actual annual deaths and the number of catastrophic injuries associated with sport, both at the collegiate and high school level. So when I looked at the average of the past 20 years, it was averaging catastrophic injury and death was 87 per year. And I'm thinking, we don't hear about this in the press and related. In 2023, the most recent, there was 92 catastrophic injuries and deaths. So this is an ongoing situation. Now, there have been some updates, and in 2012, I was actually part of an inter-association project looking at, trying to reverse the risks, the higher risks of sudden death. And then in 2017, we saw that there was an inter-association paper on transitional acclimation. So when looking at the impact of those things, there were adjustments at both times. In 2019, following that paper's release, the actual number of collegiate exertional injuries was cut in half. So there's been a lot of good work. Now what we're trying to do is amplify that good work. So the members of the U.S. registry who provided accredited credentials, inclusive of the NCSF, the NSCA, and the CSCCA, we put together representation and then brought in the NATA ICSM, their Intercollegiate Sports Medicine Council, and then brought in the United States Council on Athletes' Health so that we had proper representation and could kind of cut out any possible biases. That being said, the collective group said we're going to need to develop a kind of a rapid research study to look at these, but we need to be inclusive of all the stakeholders. So we embarked on 3 research studies that engaged the top stakeholder groups, which was strength and conditioning coaches, both at the collegiate and professional level, the academics who were doing preparations for strength and conditioning most specifically, and then we looked at the athletic directors so that we could kind of gauge, what was the reporting, and the oversight influences. And when all that information came back, we were able to formulate across several task forces recommendations. Those got consolidated into the 7 recommendations that are reported by the NCAA today. Full stop.
That's awesome. So I think for me, it's just like thinking about is just like who's the professional, how are they qualified through education or certification, how do they kind of continue to grow as professionals, and not only their continued education, but having very specific education specifically for athlete safety. Those all of those components, just like how do you really, sounds like just like being able to put the athlete in the center and just doing athlete-centered care.
And
that's what it sounds like.
yeah, and that's 100% correct. So within those 7 recommendations, it encompasses all aspect of the student athlete being the stakeholder. And so we're looking at an education minimum requirement. We're looking at a certification minimum requirement. We are looking at continued professional development in certain areas such as emergency planning and action. And then we're also looking at other aspects of influence, such as the specific reporting so that there's accountability across the different levels, but also the undue influences of the sport coach themselves and allowing the actual professional to function within the scope of practice without the influence of the sport coach, particularly as it relates to additional exertion and, to put it bluntly, the punishment workouts, if you will.
Absolutely. So I think I want to bring this to Daryl and David, and I think what really kind of prompted you to kind of look at the Athlete Alive program, and I'm thinking about it from your particular institutions, like what were those things that you were trying to address, or really kind of like whether it's the, gosh, we're looking for opportunities to improve the way we do things, where we want to highlight our institution and of the things we are doing to be really athlete centric. And maybe I'll ask that to Daryl first.
Anytime there's standards put out or best practice recommendations put out, I think As a program, you want to look at those. You want to make sure that you are following what are the best practices that are out there, and what are the standards that are out there for evaluating um, your program. Because at the end of the day, if something happens and there's a lawsuit, um, the expert witnesses that are involved in that lawsuit and the lawyers that are involved in that lawsuit are going to look at those best practices, and they're going to sit in court, and you're going to be hammered on, well, best practice A, B, C, D, E, F, G says this. Are you following this? Yes or no? And that at least gives you a head start on things. And it's just incumbent in medicine. Medicine has, the Joint Commission that goes through hospitals and goes through doctors' offices, and they have to meet certain best practice standards. And so that's why when this came out, that was one of the things that we're always looking for. What are the best practice standards that are out there, and are we following those to make sure that we're putting our athletes and our staff in the best position to be successful, in the best position to be as safe as possible.
Wonderful. David.
Yeah, just to echo Daryl, as he stated, like, these are the recommendations, in which we've had the NCAA Inter-Association recommendation since 2012. And, Athlete Alive 2025, this builds on those recommendations. And, some of the things we already had in place at the university to make sure we're following those recommendations and best practices. And the alignment we have between sports medicine and sports performance, even our administration here, and the importance of that we are following those best practices. So Athlete Alive was this a seamless transition that we had some of this in place, but we wanted to continue to leverage and make sure we're doing everything we can to promote student athlete safety with this initiative.
Wonderful. And I think maybe just expanding just maybe a little bit further, one rung lower, beyond just kind of best practices, were there any like specific trends or incidents or data points that highlighted you to take action on this? And I guess it's like open it up to anybody who wants to answer that.
I think just overall the trends of deaths in college athletics is always something that I pay attention to, being an athletic trainer, and my specialty around emergency management and doing the training that I do with various different entities and various different schools and organizations around emergency management training. I'm always cued into anytime there's a death anywhere in sports, whether it be professional, college, high school, club sports, I get the alert and I'm looking into it, and why did it happen, and how did it happen, and what could have been done to avoid that death. And obviously every single year there are deaths in college athletics. And so that first and foremost, it made me pay attention to what are the best standards, and are we following that? I oversee strength and conditioning. That's one of the areas here that I oversee underneath our student athlete health and welfare at the University of Michigan. So I can say we have incredible staff here, and I sleep peacefully at nighttime, knowing that the professionals that we have here are taking care of the student athletes and doing everything possible to prevent injuries and to make sure that not one of our single student athletes suffers a catastrophic injury that can be avoided. And there's several staffs and teams around the country. I know David and the group at Wake Forest. I know they're athletic trainers, and I know they have a great program there. And I'm sure he leaves home or leaves the office and sleeps peacefully because he knows the training and care that his staff has. Nothing's going to happen, or if it does happen, it's not going to be a preventable thing. Things happen, but we want to make sure anything that's preventable, we've taken those steps.
Absolutely. David and Brian.
Again, from us, you see these incidents happening across in the NCAA in high school, and you try to learn from them, right? You evaluate what you're doing, and if there are any blind spots you may have, and making sure, again, there's inherent risk in everything, but you want to make sure we follow the best practices. We have our EAPs. We've practiced our EAPs. They're posted. And we're doing everything we can to promote student health and welfare. And that is on our end in strength and conditioning, it's appropriate programming, but it's also making sure we're educating coaches. Again, all of this comes from the support of the administration because our AD, again, every time we have a meeting, safety is our top priority here at Wake Forest. So how do we not only say it, but how do we live it every day on our best practices? So.
Yeah, that's a great comment, David. When I do audits for athletic departments as it relates to some of these standards, one of the common things that I keep coming across is there is a knowledge of what should be done, in those emergency action plans. Everyone knows that they should have them. And one of the first things that I find is, okay, is it available to everyone, and how often is it practiced, and does everyone know what their responsibilities and accountability that's associated with any negative outcomes? Is that at the forefront of each thing? Because the reality is, from an athlete's perspective, their health and well-being is the most important thing for the athletic department, not necessarily their any other contribution. So one of the big issues I see is that people know what to do, but I think there's a prioritization situation. Whereas, don't worry about the quantity, look at the quality of the actions that you're engaged in. Don't worry about that extra workout. Give the time to practice that emergency action plan, and have those other aspects of what you and Daryl are citing, which makes your departments champions in my eyes.
Wonderful. I think we're going to talk about some implementation opportunities. I think that we're going to talk about that. But I think based on the kind of the conversation from you all, and we talked about high schools, and gosh, I remember one of the board meetings that we had, gosh, in Denver, Brian, that one of the subject matter experts we brought in, they were talking about how their child is in high school, and the strength coach at that high school program was the janitor. And that was a kind of a sidebar conversation. It's like, gosh, like the fear of that. Do you think like having programs like this Athlete Alive program with the universities that Division 1 through 3 programs, and kind of the other ones from the NCAA, do you think there would be any knock-on effects to the high schools? Like, because certainly I think they aspire to follow what the universities are doing. And do you think there is any knock-on effects to the high schools?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. So, the high schools have some regulatory function as it relates to athletic training in all the states, where there is zero associated regulation or best practices assigned to any of the high schools. Certainly those with greater resources, such as some of the private ones, do have strength and conditioning coaches, but most are going to be a sports coach that needs some added dollars or time, or it's going to be someone who is a fitness expert that somebody knows. I've seen a whole host of these things. So I think there's a significant amount of exposure. I think there's a lot of things that don't go reported. And I think a lot of times people say, well, they are an athlete, they exercise, so there's an expectation of potentials and injury and related. But when I hear about the 12-year-old basketball player who died from exertional stress and a heat stroke on the first day of practice because she was running up and down the stairs, presumably because the coach thought that she was out of shape and a little bit overweight. That's just absolutely ridiculous. And I hear these, they come across my desk more so than what other people are exposed to, but it's just unbelievable the absence of mind and consideration that's placed there. Now, that being said, we've got a great opportunity with the NCAA, backing these recommendations and adopting them as part of their overarching recommendations. But I go back to the pre-2017 when the NCAA put their foot down and said everybody's going to comply with these, and people didn't. There has to be some level of teeth and some level of accountability on this, so that we can, one, give David and Daryl the opportunity to engage in best practices with the administration and their resources, and then two, fully committing to the student athlete safety across all levels.
Any other thoughts?
No, I think there's, I think if NCAA, and we do a good job with Athlete Alive 2025 in the collegiate sector and the professional sector, I think there is the trickle down effect that hopefully for high school, and I think it's much needed. Again, we see there isn't many elite sports medicine has gotten a foothold in high school, whether that's through hospital systems or school-wide districts, hiring athletic trainers. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's one athletic trainer for the whole athletic department, but that's a start. I think the next step is making sure we have credentialed and qualified people working in strength and conditioning, if they're going to have that aspect, and if we really want to mitigate risk and mitigate the potential for a lawsuit, having the appropriate things for high school. And I think it just improves the field of strength and conditioning too, because it's more jobs, more opportunities. But it's also at the end, it improves the health and the student athlete well-being at the high school. I have a high school daughter, it's a freshman. Luckily, she's at a high school that has a strength and conditioning program, but that's not common in school districts. So whether this is, from a national high school or from a statewide or from a district wide, how do we look at, making sure, they're set up for success in these areas?
No, I would concur with everything that Brian and David said. I think anytime you have credentialing and proper credentialing, it is key. If you think around anything else, you would never want a non-credentialed teacher to be teaching your high school kids. You would never want a non-credentialed bus driver. You just wouldn't want, somebody to walk in the morning, grab the keys and go drive the school bus. So I think credentialing at any level is most important. And especially at the strength and conditioning level at the high school or under level, it's very important to make sure that there's somebody who's credentialed. And then, we can talk all day about the importance of emergency action plans and that, no matter who is present, they need to know the emergency action plan and be able to activate the emergency action plan if something were to happen.
Yeah, Daryl, that's a really good point in the fact that in many cases, the athletic trainer at that high school is held accountable for any of the things that transpire. And, I think it was to David's point, they may only have one person across multiple sports. And that was the case of the blame game that occurred at one of the colleges and universities where there was a football death that was, again, exertional to heat stress cause. And the blame from the strength coach was, well, look, we have an athletic trainer on staff. That's not my job. Didn't hold up in court. Let's just put it that way.
It's got to be a collective responsibility, not that any individual. Kind of moving on from that, I think there's wonderful opportunities. I think, Brian, when we're thinking about kind of where the registries go, or the U.S. registry is going into 2025, certainly there's some wonderful opportunities here. But I think anytime there's a new initiative or new standards, there's always challenges with implementing it. So maybe we can explore that a little bit, is just like implementing any new or standards. Were there any key challenges that you faced with implementing kind of this kind of like a holistic approach to athlete safety within your institutions?
Well, let me just lay a little bit of foundation, because when the original recommendations came out, and this is prior to 2017, where they made some adjustments with the NCAA, there was a lot of pushback on requiring all of the strength and conditioning coaches be appropriately certified. Now there seems to be more of an interest in that adoption because of the associated risks, with not having qualified people because of the court cases that have come out. And what a lot of people don't realize, one of the biggest risks to the athletic departments is actually losing the ability to be insured. So if you don't have insurance to cover your athletic department, you don't have an athletic department. So there's multiple layers to this, whether you look at it from the administrative level all the way down to, the specifics of the student athlete safety. There's quite a few considerations.
I'll hand it to David. I mean, maybe you have some thoughts you could share about how exercise prescriptions deliver it, and kind of how you coordinate between the sports medicine staff, athletic director, and kind of sports coach, and kind of the strength conditioning staff. How does that work in terms of were there any challenges you ran into with it, or from there?
Well, I think first and foremost, just to reiterate, you got to have support from the administration, right? About how the priority of the student safety for the student athlete. And I'm lucky to have that here. For us, with implementation from the strength and conditioning side, it's a lot of times into the best practices of what acclimatization looks like from a transition. And we've been fully supported not only from sports medicine with this, from that, but also from administration. We have education sessions with our coaches of what that looks like from a prescription standpoint, not only with strength and conditioning, but what does a practice plan look like in those transition periods as we're bringing people back in January? We'll have student athletes that have 4 weeks off. So what does that initial January look like, that February, which unfortunately has been labeled in the media as the killing season, right, in sports. So making sure we have appropriate prescription, make sure we have appropriate plans in place for those transitions, and making sure we're educating coaches and staff on that too, because unfortunately in the Olympic sports realm, a lot of that happens outside of strength and conditioning, more in the sport practice standpoint with some of these issues. So just making sure everybody's on the same page. And as we're providing that prescription, making sure we're doing our part as strength and conditioning coaches, communicating with sports medicine of where conditioning is happening, making sure conditioning is covered. If it's in a time of, where there is going to be heat and association in the summer, we have the appropriate things set up. Do we have a tank there we can dunk somebody? Do we have the appropriate equipment to do wet bulbs? So just, again, I'm very fortunate because we have a lot of fantastic people here with Niles Fleet heading up sports medicine, our administration supporting us. So I think those are our challenges. Talking to colleagues, we go into what is the transition. Hey, we're not going to do a conditioning test right away. We're going to start at 50%. Those are hard conversation with coaches. They want to hit the ground running. They want to make sure we're doing all those things and really, make sure we're challenging the athletes from day one. But I think we can do that, but it needs to be appropriate. It needs to be targeted, and we may need to make sure we're very deliberate with our prescription and how we're going to phase those student athletes in, especially with newcomers, and especially with the transfer portal now. We're getting a lot of student athletes in that are new to our program, right? And how do we address those issues?
Maybe to Daryl, I think one of the questions that I would have, just like, especially since you oversee from the athletic training perspective and also for strength and conditioning, kind of keying in on emergency action plans. I think about my background in aquatics, that we would always do not only in service training, but we would run emergency action plans like at least monthly, if not weekly, and under the busiest times of the year, just to make sure, here's how you run it, and then you do a debrief, something went wrong, and then being able to do that as a staff within, I think for us, it was an aquatics program that we ran at a community college, and then also some municipal programs. When we think about kind of emergency action planning within the University of Michigan, do you start to do more coordinated efforts in emergency action plans, not only with the athletic training staff, but how does the strength conditioning or sports staff, do you guys do that collaborative work on EAPs, and kind of what your thoughts are there?
Yeah, I mean, any EAP has to be collaborative. I always talk about one of my biggest pet peeves is people saying, well, I'm the only one. High school athletic trainer saying, well, I'm the only one there. Well, you aren't the only one there. I can show you a video of a monkey doing CPR. So if I can go to the zoo and get a monkey that can do CPR, there are multiple people there that can help you in your emergency. And so you may be the only athletic trainer there. You may be the only healthcare professional there, but you aren't the only one that can be involved in the emergency. And I always use the statement, who's on your pit crew? And your pit crew needs to be interdisciplinary. Your pit crew needs to involve multiple people, but anybody can call 911. Anybody can go get an AED. We teach CPR to 8-year-olds. So strength and conditioning coaches right off the top have to have CPR as part of their certification to be credentialed, back to that credentialing. But as David said, the support from the administration of, are your coaches CPR trained? Are your staff CPR trained outside of the ones that have to have it for their credentials? That's a big thing, because that adds a compressor pool. That means everybody there is trained the same, essentially, and everybody should be able to and understand how to act in an emergency and what your role is in an emergency. And, so much we focus right on the patient, but the most critical role in the emergency could be the 911 call. It could be who opens the gates, because you could have everything taken care of at the patient, but if EMS is sitting there circling around the building, or there's nobody at the door to let them in, or nobody's held the elevator, that's going to delay EMS more than anything else. So I think that's where really taking an interdisciplinary approach and really kind of looking of who's on your pit crew. and who are those individuals that are going to be involved in that emergency action plan? What training do they have? What equipment is available? And then how much have they rehearsed? Not only review, but an actual rehearsal of what's going on. And that rehearsal doesn't always have to be, this grand scheme. It can just be a tabletop activity of what would you do when. And you can review those on a daily basis. You can review them on a weekly basis. Of throw out a video, throw out a situation. I like to use in the weight room. Somebody slips while bench pressing and the bar goes down on their throat. How would you manage that? If the athletic trainer's not right in the weight room, how are you going to manage that? What are you going to do? What are some things that you need to start to think about as that situation would unfold? And I think that's where it becomes interdisciplinary. I think that's where it becomes everybody working together again for the betterment of the athlete.
And I know there's certainly, I completely agree with you. And I know there's knock-on effects to even the certification organizations as well. ACSM, for example, in 2027, they're going to start requiring first aid as part of the requirements in addition to CPR and AED, because our board was thinking that you're more likely to see a first aid incident than you are cardiovascular incident. So just being able to be well prepared into dealing with emergencies, there are certainly effects that come back to at least the credentialing agencies as well. But I kind of want to move on to a little bit about kind of improvements in communication and trust. And I think one of the thoughts was in any of these kind of professional standards, it's how to improve communication and build trust among the stakeholders, and the stakeholders being athletes, coaches, medical staff, and administrators. And in your experience, has implementing kind of these holistic approach to kind of athlete care improved any sort of collaboration across departments or teams? And kind of, if you can give an example.
I think for us, it absolutely has. Just by my position being created where there's one person overseeing everything that can have that 30,000 foot view on everything that's going on. I consider myself the NASCAR spotter that's sitting up in turn 1, but I can see what's going on in turn 3 and turn 4 and be able to tell various different drivers to go wide, go low, slow down, etc. I think that's the most important of having and building an interdisciplinary healthcare team, making sure people are leaving their ego at the door. I am a big believer that I don't care. You can be the best athletic trainer, have the best physician, and do the best surgery. But guess what? If you don't have a great strength coach, that ACL is not getting back. I don't care what you do in rehab. If you don't have a great dietitian, you don't have a great counselor, that ACL is not getting back to where they need to be, because if they're, strength coaches love to say you can't out-train a bad diet. If they're doing everything in the weight room and everything in the athletic trainer room, but they're going to McDonald's every day, they aren't going to build muscle. They aren't going to get back. So that's where I kind of take that interdisciplinary healthcare team approach and really hammer that home with everybody on that team of we all need each other. We're all on the same team. We have to work together and communicate as best we can.
Wonderful. David.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think just from if we really want what's best for the student athlete, it's everybody working together, helping them reach their individual goals, which ultimately help reach the team goals. So having sports medicine, sports nutrition, sports performance, and strength and conditioning all on the same page. Not only, I think, too, is those groups do a good job typically working together, but how do the leaders of those groups work with administration is another point of how we continue, I think, to grow as both professions and grow the interdisciplinary teams. We're lucky here. Myself and Niles Fleet are involved in sport administration meetings, so that you have a seat at the table from the groups that are the leaders of the coaches, but also the ones leading the units that are all stakeholders at the table, and ultimately all want to win, but we want to do it in a safe and effective way, and making sure, we're mitigating risks, not only from a injury standpoint, but from obviously, as you stated earlier, Brian, from a liability standpoint from the university, right? How do we do it well, and how do we do it safely, and how do we continue to push the envelope?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on
Well,
at the university? Oh, go ahead.
let me chime in there real quick, Francis, just to build on what they both said because they're making awesome points. This has got to be a top-down approach because ultimately the leadership is what's going to facilitate all of these operations, and the necessary resources need to be accounted for, and then also the individuals have to have accountability, right? So I think it was a great point that you have to stay in your lane, but you also have to hand the baton off when it's most appropriate, and every single person should have that qualified the specificity of qualifications related to what they do. So if each of those individuals are engaged in the best practices and meet those qualification standards, and they hand the baton off at the right time and work collegially together, that's going to be an awesome situation at the bottom. But if the administration at the top is not providing for the resources and the opportunities, as well as controlling some of the sports coach overreaching, it's going to be very difficult. So you might have the best team at the athletic training level, the best team at the performance level. It's just very difficult to implement the best practices when it's not being assisted by administration.
So I guess one question I had for you, Brian, is just I'm thinking about kind of beyond just the athletic department, and I'm wondering if there's opportunities is there cross collaboration or ways to communicate with kind of the exercise science departments and applying science to practice? And do you guys have anything like that at University of Miami, and whether it's yourself or others providing information back to the athletic departments, hey, here's the latest science, here's the latest research, here are the best practices that we're seeing from a research perspective, and then applying that into practice at your university?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity for the plug. The as I run the
That
graduate
wasn't set up at all.
as I run the graduate program in applied physiology with an emphasis track in strength and conditioning, we work directly with athletics, and it's also part of the whole developmental process for the young professional development, where they get internship opportunities. We have levels at which we engage, and so even though I work for an academic unit, I do all of my work in athletics, and so I also communicate with the senior medical director and others who have influence in these particular areas. The academic units can provide significant support and allocate resources, particularly if we're looking at assistance with some of the sports science and different areas where you may not have enough people to cover everything, but it gives a developmental process. And I have had students from both Wake Forest and also Michigan, great students, by the way. And, they also came with that background. So I can also see that there are other institutions that are implementing these as well.
So it sounds like this is you're talking about from the continuum of kind of hey, I'm interested in athletics as a student, and seeing it being implemented as an institution. They get to see the whole approach from internships, what they're learning in the classroom, to actual in practice. So I think that's a wonderful way to think about lifelong learning of our professionals and preparing them adequately for the profession. Do you think there's any lessons learned from the implementation of kind of a holistic care of athletes? Any lessons learned that you would like to share to others who kind of gosh, when we did this, here's some things that I think were really big key takeaways that we've done at our institution?
I can build on what I just said, partially because it allows for assistive influence. When you add the academics into the athletics at levels of appropriateness, you then can have a third voice that can be supportive of both the medical side as well as the performance side, because it's not directly coming from athletics. And a lot of times people will listen to the outside, even though they hire you in David and Daryl as the key experts. Sometimes they are more influenced by external voices, which I find funny, but very common. And so that's just one area that I think, helping the student athlete from a broad perspective and putting those guardrails up, if you will, makes a lot of sense.
Other thoughts?
I'll say the big thing is, and I think I forgot who it was, whether David or Brian said it, is having administrative support. When you have an AD, you have a president, you have general counsel, you have faculty athletics rep, you have all those different people within the athletic department are mandating these things and mandating to do what's best for the student athlete and the safety of the student athlete. That certainly helps get everybody in line. So you have to have that administrative support from the top, and that culture building from the top.
Thoughts?
Yeah, and I think too is, as you know, having that administrative support is crucial, but also continuing to communicate across the levels. I think that is making sure, we say communication works for those who work at it. So making sure you have meetings set up, whether, we want all our staff to have a meeting with their sport coach with the sports medicine once a week. We want to make sure we're having those meetings. We also want to make sure we're having departmental meetings, right? That all the stakeholders are having their chance to meet, whether that is scheduled or even just organic conversations. Because at campuses you can get spread out and stuff where you might not see all of your staff all the time. We're fortunate at Wake, we're all in one building, but just making sure that communication's happening, right? I think a lot of people, set these designs up and like, hey, this is how it's going to work, but making sure you have a game plan of how it's going to work, what are our check-in points, and how we're going to continue this communication.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Communication is key. When I have gone through some of these athletic departments, particularly related to the medical and performance sides, I always find that there's communication gaps, and a lot of times that creates specific silos, which then cause redundancies, and then gaps in what are necessary for continuity between those two areas. And I think Daryl said it. You're not going to fix an ACL in the weight room if you don't have the foreground from the athletic training, physical therapy, and the doctor's leadership, and you're not going to have it on the backside if you don't have the performance component. So we all have to work together, and check the egos at the door. It's all about winning at the end of the day while keeping the athletes safe and healthy and mentally well. So it's not a hard puzzle to put together. It's just the decision to do so. And that, again, is going to start at the top.
No, and I think that is, the perfect example, like in these situations, in these collaborative models, again, you don't have to be right, but we have to get it right. Right. And so how do we work as a team, and how do we work across units? Right.
Awesome. So kind of like rounding out kind of the last part, I think there's, of the universities, I think you always, I think for the strength and conditioning programs, you always have competing priorities. And I think maybe some programs are on the fence on whether to join the Athlete Alive 2025 initiative. Why should they join? And what are your thoughts and like, gosh, it's like, I have a lot on my plate. I have a lot of other competing priorities. Why should I even spend the time to do this? And I guess it's like to the three of you from your different positions and kind of what your thoughts are.
Well, I can start, and I'm going to speak using Daryl's words, is best practices have the word best in it. Right. So if you already have the playbook on how to be the best that you can be with your resources, why would you not want to do that? That's just a personal self-equity component. When we look at the limitations, a lot of times people have this perception of, I don't have enough time. Really, it's operational efficiencies and your organization. In many cases, I'll look at programs from these periodized models, and I'll say, you don't really have to do this much. We can get much better quality, which will alleviate some of the other time elements, so that we can build in these aspects. Because if it is best practices, then it has to be there. You can't just cut it because I don't have the time. It doesn't make any sense.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, from a strength and conditioning standpoint, I mean, I think as a profession, it's crucial that we hire credentialed professionals, right? And that's what we've done at Wake Forest, making sure, everybody's NSCA or CSCCA certified, making sure we're double checking. I would recommend all young professionals put your credential number on your resume when you apply for a job, but I use US reps all the time just to double check, right? Because as the overseer's department, the last thing I want is somebody's certification is not up to date, right? And then we have to go through that. So that's a non-negotiable when hiring. And then, just with the athlete alive, making sure, I think it's, paramount that we practice these EAPs. We have plans in place that we're doing our best to mitigate risk. And then we're also providing professional development for our staff because that's the livelihood. How do we get better and how do we continue to get better? If we're looking at that. So I think, for me, like look, my first experience with Athlete Alive was at the CSCCA. Brian did a talk and a couple other people, but it's just like, hey, all these things align with what we want to do as a university, what we want to do as athletic department, and what we want to do as a strength and conditioning department. So, I mean, I think these are, the best practices out there, and this is what we need to do to benefit our student athlete. So,
Other thoughts, Daryl, from as a
Yeah,
as
I
a
mean,
department leader?
I would concur with everything that's been said. Again, there's standards out there for a reason, and that's what you're going to be judged on at any time. And wanting to be the leaders and the best, and making sure that we're following the best practice standards that are out there.
See, those are awesome. I'm looking through some questions. You're more than for our audience. If you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A. I'll definitely pose those to the group. I think maybe is there, I'm trying to think about looking through some of our questions here. For those who justify or scrutinize expenditures from like a leadership perspective, are there any upfront costs or investments into running this type of program at your universities? So I'm thinking about it from like, gosh, we want to run this program at our university. Is it going to cost us anything, both either from a time perspective or a capital perspective, in running this kind of Athlete Alive program at your university?
Well, I'll address it from the credentialing perspective. If you go through the 3 organizations that are recognized by the NCAA, not one of them costs over $500. So to say that, there's a limitation because of resources, that's not factual. That's a decision process. Any athletic department can support the credentialing at that level for each of those, if not already done on a voluntary basis.
Other thoughts?
I would just go on and say, like, if you're not following the best practices or the recommendations, so you don't have a credential or you're not providing those resources for those people to keep their credentials, you may save money on the front end, but you're definitely potentially could lose money on the back end, right? From just a risk standpoint.
No, I would agree wholeheartedly. I always talk to people about how many zeros do you want on the check. If you aren't fulfilling best practices, you let me know, and you let your legal counsel know how many zeros you think should be on that check when something happens. And in reality, the cost of this pales in comparison to the cost of the lawsuit, and the cost of somebody's life, and the cost of not following best practices. So I would agree.
So Daryl, could you expand on that? What your thoughts are? Like when you're thinking about cost, like what does the cost look like in terms of it's like hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars of potential risk? I would clearly think that the president or provost of the university is certainly going, gosh, we want to minimize our cost. But what is the cost we're trying to minimize?
I think the cost comes from the liability of negligence, the liability of somebody being hurt, participating in hurtful practices. And I think the lawsuit costs of that just to the university. I mean, if you just think about the cost to the university, if they just get a notice of a lawsuit, and how much human resource time is spent in that's way more just in the human resource time alone that's spent in the risk manager's office or general counsel's office of tracking down documents and everything else, and talking to people, meeting with people around just a notice of a lawsuit, or even not even notice of a lawsuit, just a notice, email that comes in from a parent that says, I'm not happy with something that happened. and you think about how much time is spent and the cost of that time, that pales in comparison to what it takes to do the background credentialing and background processes that are in place, that should be in place.
Oh, Brian, you've tracked those kind of dollar amounts too. I think you've shared those with the certification, not certification board, with the CREP board, and kind of, do you quantify, I guess, the dollar amounts we're talking about?
Yeah, it's it's staggering because if you look at it at the individual level for punitive damages or related, that's going to be, you're looking at 8 figures. That number will go to 9 figures potentially if the whole institution is found at fault, which was actually potentially one of the cases that had transpired, but there was a loophole based on a voluntary requirement versus a regulated requirement. And again, you hear those numbers and you look at some of the endowments of some of these schools are like that, that doesn't make a dent. But the reality is, if you get a notice from your insurance company that says you're being dropped, you've got a major situation.
So maybe, I guess thinking about it the opposite side. So instead of like the risk part, is there an opportunity here when we think about kind of like the way kind of Wake Forest does things, the way University of Michigan does, and the way University of Miami does things, and that really kind of that athlete is the center and you're providing support, do you think there's anything that's coming on the horizon beyond kind of like pure sports medicine, strength conditioning, and sports performance that is going to be should be included here? And in my mind, it's a lot of it's maybe the behavior or mental health, mental well-being. Are they now a part of that multidisciplinary care team? And if so, how do you see that playing out?
Well, David and I had a conversation about this prior, and mental health is at the forefront in categorically many areas. And when you look at the wellness paradigm, and student athletes will fall under the wellness paradigm, we've got some considerations, and it's inclusive. I think they're all. Or David alluded to it before, but I mean, you got considerations for, mental well-being. We have sleep and recovery. Categorically, we can go through, multiple domains that we should be considering. Most schools will have a psychologist, and oftentimes in the capacity of sports psychology. But one of the challenges in talking to several institutions is the ability for that one person to reach all of the athletes, right? So, it's more on a case by case basis of need, but the reality is everyone has a level of need. And I think that there's really some opportunity in, again, within the academic space, but also through some assistantships and some mentorships, because there is an expansion, for instance, in the credentialing associated with the certification in mental health or mental performance consultancy. And so there are emerging aspects that will align perfectly with many of these athletic departments without over significant costs. But the reality is, when you have an MD level, and everyone will give you the information about, what that athletic department looks like and training department looks like, there are going to be a level, but start doing the ratio of that to the teams. And that's where the consideration comes in.
I think, David, you had some, when we kind of talked earlier, I think one of the things that you talked about is kind of the shift in culture from maximizing performance or peak performance to holistic, kind of like when you think about whole person wellness. Kind of, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I still think, performance enhancement and maximizing performance is, still at the forefront of what we do, but how do we do it safe and effective? How to do it holistically? Again, if Daryl alluded to this, just about the interdisciplinary approach. As a strength and conditioning professional, if they can't recover from it, why am I training it? Is an aspect. So if sleep's not in order, if nutrition's not in order, if appropriate recovery days aren't set in the plan, you're not getting the benefit of the work you're doing. So how do we take a step back? Still, we want to win. I mean, you asked Daryl, Michigan wants to win, Wake Forest wants to win. We want to do it safe and effective, but we want to identify what's our best approach for where we're at and how do we continue to leverage what we have in place, but then identify where some of our gaps are. There's a lot of low hanging fruit sometimes in the that we sometimes overlook, and that is, are they sleeping? Are they eating? Are they do they have proper recovery? Are we, providing those resources to them? And how do we continue to maximize that, right?
Identifying need and getting what they need when they need it. It sounds like. And so
For sure.
in the last couple of minutes here is just like, I guess if there are any parting thoughts that you would want to provide to, I guess that to the department leaders in your athletic departments, kind of why they should get involved and kind of like other thoughts. And I think, and then we'll close it out there. Maybe we'll start with Daryl first, and then go to David, and then Brian to close us out.
I would just go back to where we started of, are you following best practices? And can you look your parents, can you look your recruits, your student athletes, your coaches, your administrators, and your risks managers and lawyers and general counsel in the eye and say, yes, I'm following best practices that are out there. And I think this is one of the best practices that are out there to ensure that we have the credentialing, ensure that we have the policies and procedures and guidelines in place to provide for adequate health and welfare of the student athlete.
David.
Yeah, I concur. Again, 2012 position statement, and then 2019 was when it was re-up, just making sure we're doing everything possible from the inter-association recommendations, which align perfectly with Athlete Alive, right? And align perfectly with the NSCA and the CSCCA's joint statement on transition periods and exercise prescription. And again, ultimately, that gives us the best footing to provide the best care for our student athletes, holistically across the board. So,
Brian.
Yeah, I would reiterate the top-down approach. Athletic directors, need to provide the resources to the experts that they've hired so that they can do the jobs to the best of their ability. The other thing that I would add, just so that everyone understands the utility, if you have not done it, as it relates to the credentialing that Dave was just talking about, if you go to US Reps and click on the registry, you type in your name. If you're not in there and you believe you have a credential, you likely don't. And in many cases, it happens. I think it was brought up a little bit earlier, is someone gets credentialed and then they don't do the continued education that's necessary, or even if they did, they just didn't report it. They fall off. Technically, you are not a certified person if you are not on the U.S. registry. It doesn't matter what you've done in the past. It's not like a diploma that's good for life. Certification has limitations to it because there's expectations of ongoing support, kind of like what Daryl was saying about the emergency action plans. You have to do them. So, and it's not that hard, and it just makes you a better person. So it doesn't, within your job. So I don't really understand, pushback on that.
I think the big thing is just kind of tying to the credentialing component. I know the ACSM is slightly different because we're on the sports medicine side and clinical exercise side, but ultimately it's just, if you're trying to position yourselves as strength coaches are uniquely qualified to deliver services, you're going to have to go through the same process of accredited education, accredited certification, and then also the continuing competence standards. I can't even imagine. I think going to Daryl was like, worked with athletic training. It's like, hey, they didn't keep up with their CPDs or CMEs. They lost their license. Are you going to continue to have them as staff? So I think because you're like, well, no, that's a liability, because you're just like, you have to maintain that. And I think there's certainly opportunities, especially if you're trying to build trust between the adjacent health occupations. You got to look and smell like the other professions so you can have that trust, at least from our perspective, at least within the college at ACSM. But I think certainly there's a lot of opportunities here with strength and conditioning. And on that note, thank you so much for joining today's call. This session has been recorded. We're going to be able to put it out to on our channels, and then also to the respective member organizations of NCSF, NSCA, and CSCCA to be able to share that information with our folks. Thank you again, Daryl, David, and Brian. Have a great day and happy holidays.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Take care. Bye-bye.